Hello and welcome to Think and Reform, brought to you by futureofchristendom.org. My name is Chris Hume, and I have the privilege to be the guest host today because we have a discussion, very informal debate, if you will, between Luke Saint and Chris Poschwatta. Chris Poschwatta is from California, and he was interacting with Luke online, responding to some of Luke's videos regarding non-legislative theonomy. So we're going to get into a discussion here, and I'm going to have Luke start this off. Luke, can you open by explaining your position on non-legislative theonomy? Set the tone for our listeners. Maybe this is their first episode. What is your position on God's law and justice in the civil realm? And then we'll have Chris interact with you on that.
Yeah, so this was started when we were posting on Theonomy Q&A that we're all a group that we're all a part of, which is just a Facebook group. If anyone's interested in listening, there's a lot of great discussion on there. It's because of that group that we're having this discussion right now. It generated this discussion. I had posted my response to Dr. Wolf's musings and wonderings about non-legislative theonomy, and then some people were commenting, and that's when Chris and I started interacting on, it's something that we almost always come down to, and that is speed limits. How does this all work? It's all well and good in the ivory tower. Of course, everything's well and good in the ivory tower, but how does this all work out when the theology comes out of our hands? What does this actually look like, and things like that? And this non-legislative theonomy is different than general equity theonomy, the way general equity theonomy is currently understood, in that non-legislative theonomy does not allow the state to create new law. It just causes or institute the state as a judicial branch, much like exactly like it was instituted in Old Testament Israel. And in that model, they had no legislative function. They had no legislative responsibility. And so non-legislative theonomy seeks to do basically what they did as far as the structure of government. We believe that it's biblical. We believe it's superior to any other form of government that man can come up with. And non-legislative theonomy really goes to Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy 16, Deuteronomy 1 and 2, and things like that, to find out how do we set up a government, and what does the government look like? What are the responsibilities? In the same way that the church uses chapter and verse to justify its functions, usually, and at least it should anyway. We and a father and mother and children, we go to chapter and verse to, here's my responsibilities, here's your responsibilities, things like that. Here's what we're supposed to be doing, what we're supposed to be accomplishing. Non-legislative theonomy does the same thing with the government. Here's chapter and verse, here's your responsibility, here's what you should be doing. And that's basically non-legislative theonomy. It's reverse engineered from the scriptures, and there is no scriptural emphasis that, as far as I've seen, that anyone can point to say, here's where we need to be making new law. Here's a responsibility of the state to make new law. And that's one thing that we point out with non-legislative theonomy. And that's what I was talking about, and that's how this discussion got started on Theonomy Q&A. And I invited Chris to come on to the show. Chris agreed, and here we are.
All right. Thank you for that, Luke. All right, Chris, again, we have two Chris's here. I'm Chris Hume. I am the host here. Chris Poschwatta is the one that is going to be interacting with Luke. So, Chris, I want to let you respond to that, maybe ask questions, maybe seek clarification, maybe give your perspective, your response to Luke's videos, and allow you two to go back and forth here a little bit and just discuss this concept.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I would start by saying most of what you, Luke, say, I am on board with. I totally agree with. But I mean, my first real introduction into some of the stuff you had published, or the podcast you've done, was your response to Stephen Wolfe. So I went through and listened to both of those, and there's so much of it that I agree with. I mean, so my point isn't, I'm not on the Wolf side of things, trying to say I disagree with all this stuff. I think you get it right on so much. I guess my main question is just the idea of non-legislation in total, right? The idea, like, and you kind of explained it well earlier by saying there's no emphasis on the state for making new laws or just legislation at all. I suppose it would depend on how we're defining legislation, but when we get into specific examples, yeah, the speed limit example comes up a lot. You know, and in our conversation previously, you had said it would, like, having a speed limit law would be no different than if someone showed up at your door and forced you to go to bed at a certain time. I didn't find that particularly helpful. There's a massive category difference between those two examples, so they're not really analogously relevant to each other as far as making a kind of claim as for what legislation does. I would agree legislation should be severely limited in scope. I would say not an entirely non-legislative model, but a limited legislative model would be the closest to the biblical examples and stories that we find there. And just when it comes to Israel having a model that didn't, quote unquote, emphasize legislation, well, that's true. They don't go out of their way to give us a playbook for how to make laws, but we do see examples like of David passing the law, making a perpetual statute that remained in Israel long after the book of Deuteronomy was written. And so while I can agree and admire your desire and intent to stick with the biblical text and, like you say, reverse engineer things in a way that honors God, yeah, I'm all about that. I just wonder if, and we can get into this discussion, but I wonder if calling it non-legislation in total is maybe just a step too far, and rather we should just seek to apply biblical wisdom to how legislation is done moving forward.
A couple points with that. What David was doing was not his responsibility. It just because, I mean, that's descriptive, but it's not prescriptive. You know, I'm sure we all know the difference between that. David did legislate sometimes, and that was a warning by Samuel to the people that if you do this, he's going to be taking on responsibilities that he's not supposed to be doing. This king is, and that's what David did. And just because David made a law doesn't mean that that was part of his responsibility. It was just descriptive. Solomon had 300 wives. It's descriptive. It's not prescriptive. Solomon put a huge tax burden on the people. Descriptive, not prescriptive. You know, a lot of those guys did a lot of things wrong. David did the census. Descriptive, not prescriptive. So when David passes a law and it says it's a statute to this day, first, I don't know. Sometimes the Bible uses the same word for statute and custom. And so I don't know if that was like something that you had to do or else you'd be penalized. We don't know the penalty for not doing that particular statute. I remember reading that. And so that's not necessarily a thing that we can point to say, here's why the government should be is given the responsibility. In Deuteronomy, the responsibility of the state is laid out in Romans 13. It's laid out. It's to avenge. And God has told us what is a sin and what is a crime. And we cannot, with any sort of certainty, legislate anything new and bring anything new to the table with certainty to say, this needs to be a law outside of God's law. And just because David passed that law or that statute or that custom or whatever it was, that's descriptive. It's not prescriptive. To say nothing, I mean, and this is where we talked about too, we had a disagreement on Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32, where it says, don't add to it, don't take away from it. David clearly violated that. That he's not allowed to pass a statute. Now, if it was just, again, it became so common that it was like a statute or custom, and everyone said that's a really great idea. Let's do that all the time. Okay, that's fine, but that's outside of his responsibility to legislate. And it's not that the Old Testament didn't put emphasis on this responsibility. It told them their responsibility, and it told them where it started and where it ended, and it restricted them from making new law. It says, don't add to it, don't take away from it. And anyone who did add to it was clearly in the wrong.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful if we step back and consider, and I want to get your thoughts on this, like just defining legislation and then defining law. And I can kind of get the ball rolling. So when we read about God's law, right? The word law, the Hebrew for law is Torah, and it has more implications than merely here's a civil precept with a civil sanction attached to it. But this will become relevant as we work down this discussion. So it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that when you talk about legislation, you are thinking of it in a way that you are defining right and wrong, right? If a civil magistrate says, here's a law, it's basically making a moral pronouncement on a specific act that then there's a punishment or a sanction of some kind that follows.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think we can make a bit more of a distinction than that. And I think that distinction is biblically prescribed and is required of us as we mature in understanding the function of God's law. So on the one hand, today you could say, well, a law is something enacted by the civil government and there's a sanction to it. In biblical thinking, law includes that, but as Torah, it also includes precepts and teachings, right? It's a foundation that's underneath that. And so keeping that distinction so my point is, I would agree with you. If you say we shouldn't have people sitting around in rooms legislating morality and just making up right and wrong without any reference to God's standards at all. Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. That's a bad way to do it. And I think you rightly point out a lot of the abuses of that we have seen today and that have plagued humanity for basically forever. There's always unwise people in charge, and they make unwise laws and decisions. I don't see that as therefore all legislation is bad. I see you have like with the example with Saul, he becomes a king, and God says, it was sinful for Israel to desire a king, but it wasn't sinful for them to have a king. God says, all right, you wanted a king and you were sinful in that desire, but here's the king. But as long as you guys stick to my precepts, you'll do well and I'll be with you. Obviously they don't. Saul goes off the rails pretty quick and becomes pretty bad. On the other hand, in 1 Samuel 30, the specific passage I was referencing with David is they go off to war and a certain part of his army stayed behind to watch their goods, their provisions. And then, another portion went on to continue this battle, and they come back and they had won the battle. And the men who were in the army who actually went on to fight were saying, hey, you guys who stayed back don't get any of the spoil, right? We don't give that to you. And David says, no, that's not how this works. They stayed behind. They did a service. They're part of the army. All this stuff comes from God anyways. So no, they get the equal share, even though they didn't continue on and do the fighting. And then it's interesting that exact verse goes on to say, and David enacted a statute throughout Israel that remains to this day, obviously to this day being the time of the writing of Samuel. And you're right. It is descriptive, but it was also a just law. It was a biblical law in the sense that it was consistent with the moral precepts of God, that David's understanding of the law of Moses, the wisdom that he grew by walking in step with the word of God, spoke to him to tell him this is the right thing to do. And it wasn't a quote unquote law with a penalty prior to that. And you're right. We don't know if there was like a penalty attached to it after. But the point is, even if you don't have a penalty attached to it, it's still legislation. To bring that into our modern context, if you had speed limit laws, what we see today is a corrupt abuse of something that ought to be a good thing. And so protecting life is a foundational aspect of God's law and how he would desire mankind to behave amongst each other. So we can say, look, don't speed through a school zone. Like, that's just a good idea. You're inevitably going to kill or maim somebody, and that's obviously against God's law. So I would say you can separate the have something be a law, like a speed limit. Are you doing something immoral if you drive at 26 instead of 25? Well, no, in and of itself, it's not immoral. But in a context, if you're speeding past a school zone and you know children are present, and you just keep ignoring the fact that that could cause injury or death to somebody, you are violating a moral stipulation as far as God is concerned. Like,
what moral stipulation?
To love our neighbor.
Okay.
Right. To go out of our way to preserve life to a reasonable degree.
Okay. But just because you're speeding doesn't mean you're putting anyone's life at risk.
If it's a known situation where life is put at risk, then you are, right? So speeding past a school specifically,
yeah, well,
would you be in favor of a speed limit in front of a school, like a school zone speed limit?
Not enforced by the state, no. I mean, whoever makes that road, I think they can put whatever rules they want on there. They can make the road and say nobody's allowed on this road. That's their prerogative.
So now a private citizen has the ability to legislate, but not the civil magistrate.
Of course, on their private property. When I walk into Walmart and it says no shoes, no shirt, no service, and I try to walk in there with no shoes and no shirt, and they kick me out, that's not legislation. That's a rule that they have about their property. But we're allowed to do that. I'm allowed to put rules on my house. If I say I don't like it,
that's still the legislative principle, though.
That's not legislation because the state's not doing it. Legislation, when the state makes it, is countrywide. It's never a responsibility given by God to the state to legislate. It is my responsibility to take care and take dominion over my personal property. That is my responsibility. Mm-hmm. That's not the state's responsibility to order the people. When God says in Deuteronomy 16, justice and only justice you shall pursue. Now, being dangerous is nothing to do with justice. That's not their purview. Because I'm being dangerous, that's in the eye of the beholder. We have to find boxers now. They're way more dangerous than anyone speeding through a school zone. They're giving each other brain damage and they're killing each other all the time. Permanent damage. They're being way more dangerous than any speeder is. Now we have to find them because they're not allowed to do that. That's not loving your neighbor.
Well, let me finish my thought, because I was saying the point is you could have a speed limit where it says it's a law, don't speed through this area. Whoever's enforcing it. Now, if
it's not a law, then it's not a law. Then
if you speed through that area, let's say there's no penalty for speeding through the area, but only upon hitting somebody and maiming or killing them, then you receive the penalty, right?
Correct.
So this would mirror the parapet on the roof example.
Uh-huh.
So when I read that law, that verse, and it talks about, put a parapet on your roof because if someone falls off, they bring blood guilt onto the land or onto themselves. It's interesting that there's not a fine for that. It's like, okay, you build a house, I didn't put a parapet up. Well, there's no one going around fining you for not doing that. But if somebody falls off and dies and you neglected to put up that parapet, you are now guilty of being responsible for that person's death or injury. Mm-hmm. So I would say the point is to bring that into our speed limit scenario. The point is that speed limit needs to be recognized as a speed limit in some way. Now, whether you say, well, lawmakers on the West Coast can't make speed limit laws for people on the East Coast, well, that's fine. I think we should limit the scope, the juridical boundaries of the authority that any civil magistrate has. Like, there does become a geographical limit that is like, it just doesn't make sense to have one person in charge of making laws for 330 million people across thousands and thousands and thousands of square miles. Like, at some point, that just doesn't make sense at all. But so let's say we narrow that to a more limited scope where you have a community or a city of 10, 20, 50,000 people, something like that. And in that community, they have a general sense of, hey, we don't want people driving cars 100 miles an hour in front of our schools, in front of parking lots.
All right. So for them to make. That's not a decision for them to make. It's not their responsibility to make that decision. They can.
The whole
They cannot.
community?
The
whole community can't
the
do
whole
that?
community cannot come together and force one person to do something. What they can do is with their own private property, they can make decisions about who comes onto it and who and what they're allowed to do on their private property. They're not allowed to come together as a community and tell you and me how to do our business. If I want to put a road with 100-mile-an-hour speed limit on there, that's my prerogative. Oh, and it's in front of a school, still my prerogative. Okay.
So let's say you put that speed limit up and someone still drives past the speed limit on your private road. What do you do then?
I can kick him out, just like
And
Walmart can kick me out.
what if he doesn't listen? He says, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway.
Then I will force him out with my own security. I
So
will force him out.
coercive use, you're basically appointing yourself as the civil magistrate
No,
on your own property.
I am trespassing someone off my property, and I'm allowed to use force to do that. And if he takes it to a judge, if he takes it to a judge and he says, "Hey, this guy kicked me off his personal private property because I broke his speed limit and he wouldn't let me drive even when I was disobeying his rules," the judge is going to side with me 100% of the time. He can take me before court, but I know I'm in the right.
Based on what law would the judge side with you?
Based on what law would the judge side with me?
Like what biblical precept? If you have 100 acres of your own land and you have a road and a guy is speeding through one corner and you put up signs and you say, "Don't speed through my land," and you take the guy to court because he keeps doing it, why should the judge side with you and say you're absolutely right? You set an arbitrary speed limit of whatever you decided on your property, and this guy is breaking it. So now at this point, you absolutely have the right to take him to court. Why is that okay, but not having a community that comes together and establishes the exact same principles, which is legislation, but you're just shifting the hands of who has the authority to enact it or to
of course,
carry it out.
Yeah, I mean the Bible describes justice between a man and his neighbor. That guy is my neighbor. He is wronging me because he's broken a contract that I set up. I allowed him to go on my private property if he follows the rules. If he breaks the contract, then he gets kicked out, right? So, and that's how they did contracts back then. If you read in Ruth 4, they would make contracts, and they would do business with each other in that way. And so when I allow people on my private property, I'm contractually allowing them to be there, following not following, but assuming that they're going to follow the rules that I set up. If they break the rules that I set up, I have the right to kick them off, to put hands on them. That's my responsibility. And so
now if two people have private property right next to each other, and say you have one road that's shared through both of those properties, and one person has a speed limit that says 50 and the other one says 100, and you're cooking through the 100 zone, and then it gets to the next guy's and it's 50. How like what I'm interested in is how can we apply the biblical principles to that without making it this arbitrary, well, it's my road, my rules, you just have to deal with it, because that's not biblical either. Now, there is a certain way that can be biblical, I would say. But the point is these foundational principles, right? And especially when it comes to, well, if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you have an arbitrary speed limit on the road, all right, that's arbitrary. But if it's in front of an area where young children are present and there is a known significant increase in death and injury because of reckless driving in certain situations, right? Like obviously there's racetracks where you can drive as fast as you want. That's totally appropriate. Right. But contextually, there are differences, right? And so in a context where you have people who are trying to preserve life and trying to say, we know certain things cause death and injury, so we're going to quote unquote legislate that into, to preserve this life in this situation. And to take a step back, I agree. What we don't want is cops sitting around just tagging and fining people for driving a couple miles over a stated limit. Like that's a corrupt abuse of that. And not only that, the restitution is going to the state, when primarily biblical restitution is always oriented towards the victim of the crime. Now, if you speed by 2 miles an hour, there's no crime and you're not creating a victim. But for example, the application would be, if you're doing under 25 and somehow you still accidentally hit someone, you're following the speed limit and you accidentally kill somebody. Okay, the point is you were doing your reasonable duty, recognizing that misuse of technology could lead to death. right? It's still a bad thing that you killed that person, but your restitution will be less because you were with forethought following the rules that ideally help to preserve that life. But now if you are going over that speed limit, whatever it is, and you hit and kill somebody, now legally your punishment does apply, I would assume, even in your view, because now it's not just you broke a speed limit law, now you've actually killed somebody, right? So that's where the civil magistrate comes in, biblically speaking, using our parapet example, right? So then at that point you could say, okay, someone got hit, were you speeding or were you not? Were you acting appropriately within the context and the bounds that you knew of this community, or were you being flagrant and disregarding all of those biblical principles that it boils down to just loving your neighbor? Like, don't be an idiot when you drive, like take those things into account.
And if that's true,
if it
comes down to loving your neighbor, and that's it, just basic common sense, then why do we need a community forcing people to do it if it's just basic common sense?
Well, because that's not the only factor. It's not only basic common sense, but the Bible is very clear that there is a place for use reasonable common sense, use reasonable means. Like when we read the parapet example, God doesn't say, oh, you have to it has to be a 6-foot parapet and it has to have an encased top to it. So like you have to do everything possible to make sure no one falls off. It's like, well, no, that's not what it says. They just say, if you build a house with an upstairs patio, a roof, put a parapet on it so no one falls off. Someone could still fall off. But the point is, if you did your due diligence and built that parapet and someone fell off, you're not responsible for the blood guilt in the same way as if you had completely neglected it all.
Chris, what's your question?
Well, I guess my question is, how does just shifting who has the ability to enforce those things, how is that non-legislation? Because like, again, this depends how we define
it's contractual. Chris, it's contractual. Okay, it's not legislation because it's contractual. Okay, if I have no shoes, no shirt in my house, Walmart can't do anything to me. Okay, it's not their jurisdiction to come in here and enforce it everywhere. It's only on their property. I don't have to go on their property if I don't want to. There's nothing forcing it. However, no matter where I go, as long as I'm on a public road, it's not contractual. It is forced on me whether I want to do it or not. It's not contractual. Okay, and that is not the government's responsibility to enforce non-contractual law onto its citizens outside of God's law. It's not their responsibility. Justice and only justice. They don't regulate safety. That's not their responsibility. They are there to avenge, and that's it. And anyone who is going
to be a minister for good.
Yes, but how? That's it. They just have to avenge. Outside of that is wickedness. I mean,
it's not just avenging.
Hang on a sec. In Hebrews 13, it says submit to your leaders. Right? Submit to your godly leaders, your church leaders. No qualifications. It just says submit. Does that give the church the authority to make speed limits?
No.
Okay.
But that's a completely
but they're for your good. They're there for your good too. We can agree they're there for your good, right? So where are we getting this idea? Because Romans 13 says submit, no conditions, and then Hebrews 13 says submit, no conditions, and suddenly we bring speed limits to the Romans 13, but we don't bring speed limits to the Hebrews 13, and they're both the same. We have to submit to our leaders. And you're going to say, and I agree with you, hey, the church doesn't have the authority, the responsibility to tell me how to be safe. Where do we get this idea that the government has the authority and responsibility to tell me?
I think the church has the authority and responsibility to tell you how to be safe.
Force me to be safe.
Depends on how it's done.
Force me to be safe. Do they have the responsibility?
Force is a completely different thing than the authority to, I don't know, what would you say, encourage, to train, to teach, to exhort. Right. But we're talking about two different spheres where God himself has said the civil magistrate is given the power to wield the sword. So that
the avenger. He's an avenger. It's not arbitrary. Right. He is to avenge the wrongdoer. Right. He avenges.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. The ontology is an avenge. You can't avenge someone who's being dangerous. You can't avenge someone who's being dangerous. It's impossible. Who are you avenging? You can't avenge anyone. It's so again, this goes back to what's that?
You can still exhort them to say stop doing that because you're likely to kill or injure someone. And if you kill and injure someone, then we have every right to come in and avenge.
That's fine. That's fine. But that doesn't give them the authority to and the responsibility to create laws that are non-contractual, that I have to follow, whether I'm inside of my house, outside my house, no matter where I am. That still does not give them the authority to create new laws. The Bible never gives the civil magistrate the authority. What's that?
If they're biblical laws, it does.
Okay,
If
can you name me a law right now?
Abuse,
I can name you any law right now. Name me any law, and I can tie it back to a Bible verse. The most corrupt, ridiculous law, I can tie it back to a Bible verse. That's the problem that we're seeing here.
No. Because now you're saying that if any law if any corrupt law can seem to have a biblical foundation, therefore all legislation is bad. That's way oversimplifying.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all.
You're not correctly keeping the distinctions, because if you have an abuse of a law,
I'm not saying that, Chris.
Based on an abuse of a biblical passage.
Chris. Hang on a sec. This is what I'm saying. I'm saying this, that you said, well, not if they're biblical, and I'm saying that you cannot name me any sort of law that we've passed in this country in the last 300 years that isn't biblical. That some guy can say, hey, look, I found a Bible verse to tie it to it, right? So once you create a legislature, it doesn't end. There's no stopping. And anyone can point to, well, it's biblical because, look, I found this verse over here and I can connect it to. And once they create the law, then what are you going to do about it? Vote them out of office? The law's still there. And that's the problem, because once you establish legislator, it doesn't end. They keep on creating laws. And then you and I can go back and say, hey, that's not a biblical law. And they say, well, I found this Bible verse right here. Look, building codes, all this zoning laws. And I've heard them say this. Zoning laws are okay because of the parapet law. See, I tied it back. It's okay. It's okay for the state to come onto my property, destroy the building that I made because I didn't register it, and then fine me, and then make me pay a permit because of the parapet law.
You're still confusing it. I agree. So you're pointing out legitimate abuses, legitimate corruptions of these things. And I agree. There are legitimate abuses and corruptions, and there are people who take those corruptions and abuses of law and make it sound like they're being biblically consistent. But what I'm saying is, just because that does happen does not mean that is always what happens. It is possible to have a biblical law that rests on consistent biblical exegesis that is consistent with the biblical principles of God.
That's in the eye of the beholder, Chris. That's in the eye of the beholder. That's in the eye of the beholder. Well, it is.
Not if you're not if you're studying the Bible. It's not.
No. We're all studying the Bible, Chris. We're all studying the Bible here. Have you ever heard Stephen Wolfe? He's tying everything he says back to biblical law. Everything.
When everybody
tell you where to put your pulpit.
Right. But when everybody is saying, well, we're studying the Bible, we're doing this, you're right. This happens in every theological study, whether it's eschatology, whether it's the law, whether it's soteriology. You have 1,000 different views on all of this stuff, and everybody's claiming there's the biblical one. So what do? We throw up our hands and say, well, there's no objective way to know. So you do you and I'll do me.
No. We say, thus saith the Lord. We go to where the Bible is clear. Yeah. Here's your responsibility. Do this and don't do that. When it says,
and you find the reason I'm reformed, the reason, and I assume the same is true for you, the reason where we are reformed, and I'll just tell you how I got there, because when I became serious about studying the Bible and being a Christian and wanting to know what that meant, I was so frustrated years ago with how many different views there were. Because I didn't know. I grew up in a church, but kind of drifted away. And then I came back and said, you know what? I actually need to take it upon myself to study this stuff and to know which way to go. Because there's 100 different churches 5 blocks from me, and I could pick one, but how do I know which is right? So I took the responsibility to dedicate a ton of time to figuring out basically who got it right. And that means familiarizing myself with Scripture, and then going back through church history and say, how did people explain this? How did they understand this? Why was there a different here? And then I just try to apply consistent standards across the board. So when I look at Calvinism versus Arminianism, all right, why am I a Calvinist? Well, it's because I went to the biblical data. I saw how both of those schools of thought dealt with the biblical data. And I just said, which one's the most consistent and which one is right on that basis? Now, does that mean that I can just show up to an Arminian and convince them of my view? Well, no, he's locked in on what he wants to do, right? So I'm not saying it's easy, or I'm not saying it's automatic. But my point is, bringing this back to our law discussion, just because you have people who are abusing and taking corrupt notions and making it sound biblical in law, all right, that does happen. What I'm saying is there is also a correct way to take biblical principles on a biblical foundation and enact law that is honoring to God. And yes, despite what you say, there is a place that it stops. There's
okay. I have chapter and verse saying don't do that. What you just said, don't do that. I have chapter
Deuteronomy 4:2
and Deuteronomy 12:32. Do not add to it. Do not take it away. And
has any law since that law was written in Deuteronomy? Has any law changed? Has any law at all from Deuteronomy 4, from Leviticus, from Exodus, have any of them
some of them
been added or taken away?
Some have been fulfilled, but the ones that were added were if they were added in the way that Moses told them not to do, if they were added, were unbiblical.
Okay, so how do you know the difference?
Because Deuteronomy has a start and then a middle and an end, and we know what those laws were, and that's the responsibility of the state to enforce those laws. Or you could add Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in there as well. There's a beginning and a middle and an end. The laws are limited. So anytime someone...
So there's like whole chapters of Leviticus that we don't act on anymore. They're not law to us anymore.
Okay.
Right?
So?
All the ceremonial, we can say. Okay. Right?
Yes.
Okay. So the point is, if you take Deuteronomy 4:2 as an unqualified absolute, you're making mincemeat of the text. It's clearly not an unqualified absolute.
No.
Right? Because law was added or taken away from that point in time.
By God, but not by man. God's allowed to do it. He's allowed to change it. You know, a change of the high priest, a change of the law. That's fine.
Right.
That doesn't mean since God did it, that I'm allowed to do it. Right? The principle's still there.
That's very true. So let's go back to our example with David. All right. It's your position that in 1 Samuel, when David enacts a statute that was said to be perpetual, that he was violating God's word. He was doing something. I'm
not willing to say yay or nay on that, because I don't know if he was like bringing people up and fining them because they didn't follow it. Right. That's a description.
Yeah,
we don't know. So it's not really a good thing to point to say, here's why we need to be doing it or why it's good, because it just described what David did. Now, Jehoiada was given 2 wives by the priest. I forget his name. He was given 2 wives. That's descriptive. Does that mean it was good? Does that mean polygamy is okay now? No, of course not. We don't judge the descriptive passages and say, well, okay, here's what they did. That means I can do it. You know, Jehoiada was the priest. He gave Joash 2 wives. He gave 2 wives, right? And so the polygamists are like, see, look, polygamy is okay, right? And so we don't take the text of here's what happened and say, okay, therefore I can do it. We go to the clear text, Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 12, where it says, don't legislate, don't add or take away to the law. That's what God can do it. He can fulfill it. But the weightier matters of the law are justice, mercy, and faith.
But it's okay to do that if you're making contractual legislation among sovereign citizens.
You're not legislating at that point. You're making rules, and you're making contractual commitments to each other, and not contractual stipulations. Now, obviously, it's the same.
But then you're saying one of those parties has the right to coercively enforce the contract in a way that the civil magistrate doesn't. In your view,
yes,
except for the fact that God has specifically said the civil magistrate does have that authority.
So we are told to and avenge people. Yes, avenge
and be a minister for good. Yeah,
be a minister for good. That's not a blank check, though. That's not a blank check.
Well, no,
they can't come into my house.
It is.
No. This is what I'm saying.
You're making it sound like it's this all or nothing. That if I say, look, there is a way to have legislation that does not violate
not a biblical text. That's not a biblical claim.
It doesn't exist,
Chris. That's not a biblical claim. That's not a biblical claim. There is a way to have biblical legislation if we do it the right way. Not a biblical claim. That you can't exegete that from the scriptures. The Bible
by definition, it would be legislation that is biblical, right? That would be the right way to do it. And
the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that. Never says legislation that is biblical is okay. Never says that. Okay, that's not a claim. Okay, if you read Psalm 119, it's not talking about his ability to legislate. It's talking about the extant law. On his law he meditates day and night. Who can discern his errors? Those kind of things, right? I consider all your ways to be right. And 1 Peter, he's getting everything.
We got case laws?
What's that?
Like how do case laws happen historically? How do they pop up?
You're talking about like a judge makes a ruling and the next guy makes a ruling based on the last case?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how do they, like, you asking me like the jurisprudence behind them? How do they happen?
Yeah, I just mean, so in your view, would that would be unbiblical, you're saying? So if you, because I've heard you say the biblical law is a judge, right? Not a legislator, but a judicial function,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
A judge hears a case, he makes a pronouncement.
Yes.
So from now on, if we take your view, no judge is allowed to pronounce a judgment over a case and say, also, in any like case in this situation,
Correct.
a similar pronouncement, a similar judicial can never be enacted perpetually.
No,
it just has to be
not.
every case by case by case by case.
Every case by case. Every case is different. So the judges, have to. I mean, they can look at other cases where the judge made a decision, and they can talk to him. Hey, what'd you do in this? This sounds like the same thing. Okay, I'll make that decision too. But just because one judge makes a decision over here doesn't mean I have to do the same thing. Two judges aren't going to see everything the same way, right? They judge everything
brings up
differently.
the jurisprudence, right? You're right. The idea of jurisprudence, applying wisdom to making
Yes.
just pronouncements.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I think is underdeveloped in our tradition of law, especially like common law and in the West. So that would be something I would be immensely interested in having be more diligently applied in cases. So I agree. It's not as if, if we were just going to use the speed limit, somebody was driving 30 miles an hour and the judge said, well, you were driving 30 on this road, therefore here's your punishment. And then another judge 100 years later, 1,000 miles away, was aware of that previous pronouncement and says, oh, well, he fined you for driving 30, so I'm going to do the same thing. Well, no, again, this is just a very basic level of kind of reason and common sense that you would apply to that situation and just say, well, he was driving 30, but it was in front of a school zone, or it was in a parking lot that was packed full of people. So we understand why he got fined for that. But then you could say, but you were driving 30 on a highway out in the middle of nowhere. Obviously, I'm not going to fine you for that. So I think that should be an area that gets more developed and can be more developed even within a minimal legislative situation, right?
Okay.
I guess I'm having a hard, like you keep saying, well, that's not biblical. Legislation's not biblical. But the idea of maturation, like using in Hebrews, where is it? I was just reading it. I think it's Hebrews 6, where it talks about being mature through experience to have your senses trained so that you know good from evil, right? That knowledge of good and evil is, biblically speaking, it's a function of a judge to judge what's good and what's evil, but it's something that comes with experience as we grow in wisdom, right? Adam and Eve ate the fruit, got the knowledge of good and evil, but they weren't mature enough to handle it, right?
Okay. What's your point, Chris? Well, get to the point.
So my point is, you keep saying it's not a biblical idea that all legislation is off the table, whatever. But the point is, there are built into the laws of God that men are supposed to grow in wisdom, and when they make judicial pronouncements, it is not unbiblical to then make that a perpetual thing throughout the land, wherever you happen to be, and in the time
it is unbiblical. I have chapter and verse saying that is unbiblical. Don't add to it. Don't take one of these laws that is for everybody. You have
chapter and verse of God telling Israel in a very specific context not to add or take away from the law. But even in that context, when David does it, it's not called unjust. It was actually seen as something moral and good.
Then we've got to remove all of Deuteronomy, and now all of Deuteronomy is
no. So this is that all or nothing again. You're saying, well, if I grant your premise, then it just explodes into this never-ending avalanche of
it does. Historically speaking, that's happened 100% of the time. Chris, historically speaking, that's what happened.
Historically
always
speaking,
had every time a legislator has been established.
And ethically speaking, that's different.
Okay,
right?
we're not talking principally and ethically. We're talking biblically.
We are. We're
every time a legislator has been established in a nation, it has always inundated it with laws, and so that people cannot understand the law. 100% of the time, it's happened. The only time that never happened.
When they go bad, they get deposed.
Sometimes yay and sometimes nay. Do you think the Pharisees were deposed? No, they weren't. They
Are they still alive?
legislated a hedge
Where
around
are they
them.
now? They died, right? So nothing lasts forever, right? So again, you're just making it sound like if any legislation is ever on the table, no matter how godly and biblical it is, the ultimate, the end of that will always be corruption and perversion.
Absolutely.
And historically, that is what we see.
Yes.
But the fact that that's what we see historically,
what else do you want, Chris? As biblically and historically, what else do you want?
I'm saying biblically, there's a difference between establishing a principle that you ought to enact and people trying to enact it, and the is of what historically happened not living up to the ought.
Has God given the state the responsibility to? Chris, has God given the state the responsibility to come up with principles that people ought to follow?
To come up with? No.
Yes.
To enact biblical? Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. No. Wait. Where did you get this enact biblical law? Where did you get this? Laws based? Okay. Laws based.
Civil magistrate. Yeah.
Is to legislate where?
And is a minister of for good.
Legislation. Where do you see legislation in there?
Everywhere where a law is enacted, or where a law is defended, where a law is created, where we're told to listen to our leaders, to follow rules that unless they command you to do something inherently.
No, that never says that. Chris, it never says that. Chris, you don't know your Bible. It never says that. You just told me something the Bible never says. It never says follow them unless they tell you how to sin. Never says that. What are you talking about?
The Bible doesn't tell Christians to obey their leaders. Didn't we just have that conversation?
No, we never. Now, hang on a second. That's not what you said. You said we have to. The Bible tells us to follow unless they're making us do sin. It never says that. Okay, never says that once. Now, the responsibility that God has given to the family, we know what it is. Responsibility that God has given to the church, we know what it is. The responsibility given to the state, we know what it is. And it's never legislation. And there's nothing in the Bible that says they should be legislating. And here's a responsibility: legislate. In fact, we see the opposite. And when Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8 through 11, he says the law is good if it's used lawfully. And you're arguing, let's not use it lawfully. Let's use it principally. Yes, you are. You're saying we need to find principles and make laws based off those principles. That's what you said. And that's not.
I'm not saying we need to find them. I'm saying we take the already biblically prescribed principles that are embedded in every example of a law we see in Scripture. I think the other thing too that's
not a biblical claim.
They read Deuteronomy as if it's a legal code, as if it's here's a law.
It was a legal code.
Here's the law. Here's the punishment.
Yes.
Well, it's a lot more than that, but it's also not an exhaustive legal code.
Why not?
Now,
how do you know it's not an exhaustive legal code?
Because it says nothing about cars, for example, and there are cars today. So did God just not know there were cars, or are there principles embedded in it that we can apply to the use of modern technology? See, this is what I'm getting at.
Chris, that's ridiculous. Chris, that's ridiculous. Just because it doesn't say anything about cars, it's not exhaustive. It's just because it doesn't say anything about cars doesn't mean it's not exhaustive. It is exhaustive.
Principally, it's exhaustive, true. But by the letter of, is every situation that mankind will ever come across, has that dealt with in the Bible?
Yes.
In specifics.
Yes.
Luke, respond to that quickly, and then I want to ask a question here of Chris. So, Luke, respond to that, and then I want to continue this. It's a great discussion. These are the discussions we need. Respond to that quickly, and I want to ask a couple questions here.
What I'm saying is, okay, the Bible doesn't, this is the problem here. The Bible doesn't tell me how to cook a cheeseburger, right? If the Bible wanted you to know how to cook a cheeseburger, it would tell you. It is exhaustive because everything that needs to be addressed legally is addressed in the scriptures. We have the case law there. Everything that we need to know is there. It is exhaustive. No one can add to it or take it. No one can improve upon it. Right? So the adjudication, yes, you can take principles and adjudicate, but the Bible never gives us the responsibility to legislate. Never once was the state told, you got to start legislating and taking principles and all that kind of stuff. That's an anti-biblical claim. If you read through Psalm 119, never once is David's own take on the law exalted. He says, all of your ways I consider to be right, and who can discern his errors? The law of the Lord is perfect. And as is, it is enough to govern society. First Peter chapter 1, chapter 2, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, he has given us everything that pertains to life and godliness. Everything. And so,
so when we apply that to cars.
you apply that to cars. If the Bible doesn't speak about it, then the state shouldn't be speaking about it. That's all.
All right.
That's
Luke,
not a biblical claim.
hold that thought, Luke. You'll get a chance to respond again here, both of you. For the sake of our listeners, you brought this up in the beginning, Chris, seeking to define legislation. I would like to do that, try to do that again, based on the conversation between you two men here. Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is when you talk about legislation, it is a rule that carries with it punishment. So, yes. You would argue biblically, there's an authority in the civil magistrate to wield the sword, that is to avenge someone who has been wronged. Mm-hmm. And so there is someone that brings a case to the magistrate and says, I've been wronged. And then the judge uses wisdom to look at that case. That's not legislation, because the judge is not making a rule that other people are going to be punished for if they don't follow.
No.
Is that a correct conception of your understanding?
When Solomon, used, see, this is the thing, Chris, both Chris.
All Chris's.
All Chris's.
All Chris's.
The Bible never gave Solomon case law or a law to deal with what happens when two prostitutes start arguing over which baby is the baby that's theirs. And you could say, see, look, it's not exhaustive, but it was still enough for Solomon to adjudicate and find out the answer. He didn't need to create a new law, and he didn't create a new law after that. It didn't become case law.
All right, Chris, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. Given that definition of legislation, would you? I think you said this. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you still hold that Luke is arguing for legislation to come from a different source? If he's saying that legislation is making a rule that you can be punished or fined or whatever simply because you don't follow this thing, absent of someone bringing a charge before a magistrate and saying, hey, this person wronged me in this way, would you still contend that Luke's still arguing for legislation just from a different source?
Well, in one sense, yes. In one sense, no. I would say if we're defining legislation as someone now creating a new moral rule, like it's a moral wrong to do X, Y, or Z.
Take your speed limit, because I want to ask you about that. Going 50 and a 25.
Sure. Yeah. So if I say it's a law that you can't drive faster than 25. So then someone says, well, you're legislating that, therefore 26 is an act of immorality, right? I would say, no, that's not what we're saying, right? So I would say, but then you say, well, what's the punishment if I drive 26? And I would say, well, if you don't hit anybody, then nothing. If nobody brings a charge against you, then there is no punishment. Okay. Then you might say, then in what respect is that legislation? I would say, well, it becomes a step that you have a codified, here's a regulation on a piece of technology on this road, in this place, don't drive the car faster than 25. If you break that in and of itself, nothing bad happens. You're not doing anything wrong. But if you violate that speed limit and you cause an injury and somebody brings that case against you, right? I mean, these days you would call it a cop, but if it were a neighbor who saw the event happen and they said, I saw that dude speeding and I'm bringing him to court, well, fine. But that piece of legislation was still codified and was still known by the people for it to play a role in the legal process that's going to unfold afterwards.
What if they were following the speed limit and they hit someone and killed them?
Yeah, then that would be a slightly different situation, because stuff still happens, right? And I guess the point is that,
but could they not be reckless? Could they not be reckless if they were following the speed limit?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm not saying this is the only situation it can apply to. I'm just using it as one example. But yeah, there are other ways of being reckless that aren't just breaking the speed limit. But yeah, I mean, we're just dealing with one specific example because I think it kind of brings to light some of the issues that we're talking about.
Well, my problem with that is the designation is arbitrary. The state needs to tell us how to be safe. and they need to control the roads, and they just tell us how to go fast, what kind of speed we need to travel. That's an arbitrary designation. Why them? Why do they have to do it, or else what? Well, chaos.
Well, I didn't say they had to.
Okay, well, that's the whole point of this discussion. Whose responsibility is it to regulate the people and make sure that we're safe? I'm saying
it's the people,
right?
Using God's law as the standard. But how is that non-legislation if all you're doing is shifting who enacts it and who builds the law from the civil magistrate over there, some federal entity, to just a community doing the exact same thing in a more localized way? How is that any different?
The community does not have the responsibility to punish people based on the laws that they pass. It's not their responsibility to pass laws. The community is not supposed to pass laws. That's not what they're supposed to do. That's not our responsibility. And the only way they can do it is through the state. That's the only way that they can do it. If you take away the state, the community can't pass any laws. So
I think there are situations where the community absolutely does have the obligation to say, we need to preserve life. We know certain things end life. So we're going to live in such a way that we recognize those things ahead of time and quote unquote legislate or regulate or have a contractual agreement amongst each other that says, if you do this, like the reason it's you're not supposed to do it is not because that thing is immoral in itself, but it's a hedge prior to committing the act that says
that's the Pharisees. We're back to the Pharisees. That's what the Pharisees were doing.
The
exactly
law.
That's exactly what the Pharisees were doing. That's exactly what the Pharisees were doing. They were like, I'm going to stop you before you sin. Yes.
Chris, hang on a sec, Chris.
I disagree.
Is all your
maybe I'm not explaining myself?
Yeah, Chris. Let me ask a clarifying question. Chris, is all you're saying? Are you saying that a community, the people, can say, hey, in our judgment, we think going 50 or selling, I want to give some other examples here, selling raw milk or anything. They say, in our judgment, this might not be safe. And we're going to put everybody on notice of that. And if wrong happens, you know, the judges in our community are probably going to say, well, you know, this is pretty unsafe. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying by legislation, because I'm confused. I think our listeners might be too. You're saying that, hey, they can still legislate. They can get together and make rules. But you also said previously, if the person is speeding and they don't harm anyone, nothing comes of it. So I'm trying to understand what you're saying about legislation. I think I understand what Luke's saying. There is no new legislation. If someone wrongs me, I go to the judge and tell them what happened, and the judge adjudicates. What are you arguing for that would be, hey, I've broken some rule. I don't have anyone coming and demanding restitution, and yet this entity of the state or the magistrate still fines me? Like, what would be an example?
How would they find you?
No, fine me. They fine me, or they make me pay, or go to jail, or whatever.
Right. How would they fine you if nobody brought a case against you? How would they fine you? But my point is, I'm trying to get to the foundation of what it means to legislate. And I see there's a bifurcation, if you will. On the one hand, you have God being the supreme legislator. There's a moral law that he is legislate, and he is given stipulations and commands based off of all of that, right? So that's a moral bedrock, quote unquote, legislation that I see. Built on that at various times in various civilizations, there is what we could call man-made legislation. And this is what Luke is completely denying, but I think it conflates the idea that if I am a human and I look at God's law as it existed in the context of the Old Testament and say, there are all these great biblical principles built in there, but some of for example, technology has changed. So what was an axe head? What was a parapet? What was an ox? We can use those principles and apply them to how we use technology today as a car. Now, if I do that as a human, am I redefining God's bedrock moral foundation? No. So if what Luke is arguing against, in my understanding, is that if man tries to do it that way, it's wrong. And I agree. I'm not saying we can just sit in a room and come up with like what we think are new moral standards for everything and then start fining people for breaking them. That is what I would refer to as the abuse.
But a community can.
No,
a community
nobody
can. Okay,
Nobody
All
can.
right.
Because I'm talking about that's God's job in his role as supreme lawgiver. But as man being a subversive, made in the imago Dei, the lawgiver for humankind in a specific context, in the, what would you say, in the culture that they live in, yes, they can say, well, look, we're not Israelites. We didn't live back then. We don't have the same kinds of economy and situation going on. So a lot of those laws, while they were great for Israel, they just don't really carry over and apply to us today. But there are situations today that crop up where it says, hey, it's probably a really good idea based on God's moral foundation to not let people speed through school zones, because otherwise people will die and we want to preserve life. So you say, okay, don't speed through school zones. Now, does that mean if I'm in a community and we enact that as a quote unquote law or a regulation, that people on the other side of the world are somehow beholden to it? Well, no, of course not. It's applying to a local context, but that then separates it from God's moral foundational bedrock, which he's given us in his scripture, to using wisdom to apply it in all these varying circumstances as time goes on.
Chris,
does that seem like a meaningful distinction? Do you guys recognize that?
Luke, I want to let you respond to that, but Chris, I'm still confused for the sake of our listeners. Are you saying that if they come up with that rule, but you said that nobody's going to be punished for driving over the speed limit if they don't cause any harm? Correct?
If nobody brings a case against them, but let's say you do that, you speed through the zone and people watch you do it day after day after day, and eventually they do bring you in front of a judge. All right, well, they're acting on legislation.
Right, and you haven't done anything evil, correct?
Correct, yeah. The speeding itself is not the evil.
Okay, and you think that a judge would be righteous to say, okay, you broke this rule, you haven't harmed anyone, you haven't broken any of God's laws, but you have to pay money to who now?
Well, I don't know that paying money to who would be the appropriate response in that particular situation. But if that person sped and hit someone and maimed them for life, then they should keep. Yeah, that's a different situation.
Yeah. Why do you need a new law for that? I mean, if someone hits someone, whether it's with a car, a donkey, a baseball bat, we don't have laws for all these other, like, why can't the judge just look at the case and say, hey, you're in the wrong?
Well, because this would go to establishing the continuity of it, right? So just if a judge makes a case in a given situation and that situation happens a lot across time, is it inherently unbiblical? And I feel like I know what you guys would say, but I don't see the Bible saying it is unbiblical to just, quote unquote, like David did, enact that as a perpetual statute that applies to the people in that place and at that time, for them to all just know, hey, we had individual judges make a pronouncement on all these cases that have relevant similarities, right? Speeding plus an injury or whatever, they make a decision. You could just have each judge like come up with that on the fly without it ever being codified for the people to learn and to read and to study on their own.
Okay,
right?
Chris, you didn't answer me last time. You didn't answer me last time. But what does Deuteronomy 4:2, do not add to it, do not take away? What does that mean to you? How do you apply that?
Yeah. Well, I thought I did answer it, but maybe it just wasn't very clear. It was given to Israel in a specific context in a specific way. And so God gave that nation all those laws that included many things that are not laws for us today in the same way as they were laws for them back then. So as far as Israel was concerned, do not add, do not take away, the letter of it, quote unquote, yeah, that absolutely applied. But what I see then when I read David enact a statute, I know you said he was wrong or whatever, he shouldn't have done it, he didn't have the authority to do it. I disagree. Yes, that passage is speaking descriptively, just telling us this is what David did, but it is speaking favorably on David for doing so. And so while it's not then this springboard into, oh, well, that means any magistrate anywhere can do whatever he wants. Well, no, obviously not. That's not what I'm saying it means. But I am saying, especially when you look at Saul versus David, you have Saul, the bad king, making bad legislation, and you see David, the good king, making good legislation, at least in that one area. Now, David also makes mistakes too. So I'm not trying to make any absolute claims about if you're elected by God, then everything you do is automatically right. Like, no, I'm just saying the Bible gives us these two separate views on how legislation could go that isn't redefining morality itself, but is just making wise laws for people in a specific place and time.
Okay,
and
if
Deuteronomy
David,
4-2 is not violated by David doing that.
you don't think David violated Deuteronomy 4:2?
No.
If he made a law that was for all of Israel, then now you have to do it this way. If he made that law, you don't think it was violating Deuteronomy 4:2?
Let me give you another example. The answer is no, I don't think he was. But when the commandment says thou shalt not bear false witness,
I think that's eisegesis.
When the commandment says thou shalt not bear false witness, right? Don't lie. That's a law. That's a command from God. Do not lie. Well, then you have, who was it? Rebecca, who lied to her enemies in war and was called righteous for it. So if all you do is isolate the commandment that says do not bear false witness, thou shalt not lie, whatever it says.
It says do not bear false witness against your neighbor. It says do not bear false witness against your neighbor. She wasn't bearing false witness against her neighbor.
All right. Well,
following the commandment.
So again, it's not an absolute at that point, right?
No, it's her not following. It's her fulfilling the commandment. She didn't bear false witness against her neighbor. There's nothing. She didn't do anything wrong.
So the idea of it being a neighbor is relevant, because I agree. There's a relevant difference.
Yes. Yes.
But
it's
the
not
point
just this
is,
commandment never lie. It's not just the commandment like don't ever say something that's untruthful. It says don't false witness against your neighbor. And anytime you bear false witness against your neighbor, that's wrong. If you bear false witness in a wartime situation, or if you are Hebrew midwives and you lie and say, hey, they had them before we got there, now you're bearing false witness for your neighbor. That's good.
Right.
So I mean
but we have to go beyond the single verse to recognize how that applies beyond it. My point in all that was saying if you isolate any single verse of the Bible and call it an absolute without any reference to any other verse,
Psalm 119. Psalm 119. I'm not isolating it. Psalm 119 says the law of the Lord is perfect. That's what it says. Mm-hmm. And First Peter chapter, 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3. He's given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Mm-hmm. And First Timothy chapter 1, the law is good if it's used lawfully. Hebrews chapter 2, every sin received a just recompense. I'm not isolating these. The Bible never says that we need to come up with new laws based on principles. It always says time and again, the law is enough. He has shown you what is good, to do justly, love mercy.
Okay, what if I called it application instead of making a new law? What if I said we're applying an old law?
If you said we are applying it to a different circumstance, I mean, that's up to the eye of the beholder. I mean, of course, you can do that. And we've always maintained on this podcast that the law is still applicable, is still valid in its application. So if you apply it to different situations, that's fine. But what you can't do is say, just because I applied it this way, now you have to apply it this way. That's wrong. So the legislative function is restricted to God. The role of the magistrate is to say, okay, here's the laws. And then when you violate them, I judge between a man and his neighbor. And that's it. And it's not their responsibility, nor of the community, to make sure that everybody is doing everything safely according to the way that they do it. They can strive for it.
Why is it not the community's responsibility? And I want to let me just qualify that. By responsibility, what I don't want to see are people running around like cops just being narcs, right? Just saying, "Oh, you violated that." We both agree that that's an abuse of how all that should work. But when you say it is not the community's responsibility to, you might say, force people to follow these arbitrary laws, I would say, well, not force them, but it is a community responsibility to train each other up in the way they should go, right? The family does that. Neighbors do that. Pastors do that. You could do that. Employers, a master-slave situation, right? Like there's all these different ways that can play itself out. But what I am saying is, it's also not wrong for a community to then start codifying some of the rules they have for their community that play a role in the juridical process as things unfold.
It's quite wrong.
Right?
Community cannot force their own people to act a certain way. It's not their responsibility to do that. That's not given to them by God, that responsibility.
Biblically, there are restrictions on that, yes. Like if a parent has an unruly child, they can drag him in front of a magistrate, right? There's community involvement. When the community then throws stones at the people they convict, there's community involvement.
Yes.
So,
right. But their responsibility is to enforce God's law. Now, I will say this. The byproduct, you might have heard me say this before, the byproduct of the establishment of justice and righteousness in the land is safety, is regulation, is order. That's the byproduct. The byproduct are these things if we establish justice in the land. However, if we start trying to establish injustice so that we can get safety and order and peace, then we will get none of those things. So the reason that Israel had rest for 80 years is because they had established justice and righteousness in the land. And they didn't need anything else, no legislation added to it, to get order and peace in the land and safety. Now, if we're talking about a community wants the people to be safe, the only avenue towards that is to establish justice and righteousness in the land. And if we cannot neglect justice and righteousness and try and skip over that and say, let's do bad so that good may come of it. If the community says, okay, we're going to force everyone here, everyone, I don't know who this community would be because it ultimately comes down to some sort of small body, right? No community has ever come in one mass and forced somebody to do something. It's always been one or two people forcing the community or leading the community. So I don't know how this would happen, but without legislation, now you can say things like, okay, customs will happen, right? Maybe a certain community in a certain area, maybe they don't like somebody from a separate country, a different country. And when someone goes to that community, the community just naturally doesn't give them a place to live. They don't treat them well, and the person leaves. Okay, that's a custom, and that's definitely going to happen. However, they didn't need to legislate to do that. They didn't need to come together as one to say, okay, every time someone from this country comes, we're going to treat them bad, and then they'll leave. Hopefully, Customs can come out. Customs and customs and traditions will regulate us better than law can. And so, what I'm arguing against, yes, customs and traditions will come out. The handshake obviously has never been legislated, yet we all know how to do the handshake. Now, if we establish justice and righteousness in the land, there will be a higher premium placed on customs, as it was in Ruth chapter 4, when Boaz took off his sandal and gave it to the guy. Not a law of God. That's not a law. And if he didn't do it that way, that would not be unjust. However, in the community at the time, the custom of the day was to do it that way. Okay, higher premium placed on customs. The more you legislate, and I'm preaching to the choir, but the more you legislate, the lower the premium on custom and traditions. So the things you're talking about, like, well, the community should be doing this, and the community should be doing that, and the community should be looking out for their own people. That will happen naturally if we establish justice and righteousness in the land. That will happen naturally. If we decide, okay, I'm going to forego God's idea of justice and righteousness in the land and kind of take my own and institute my own take on it, then we're not going to get peace and we're not going to get customs and traditions that regulate people. We're going to get statism, as has happened 100% of the time. We both agree that's always happened.
I do agree. Statism is something that we need to avoid. I guess, so this is what I'm thinking through right now is I agree with so much of what you're saying. I really do. And I would be all in favor of having there be more custom versus coercion, right? You want people to do things because they are desirous to do them, and it's how they grow up, and you don't have Big Brother being Overwatch that forces people to do that. I agree. And we want to limit that as much as possible, that coercive function of law. But the whole point behind law and the fact that it's coercive by its nature is precisely because there is not justice in the land, as you would say. It's because people are sinful. It's because, you can have X amount of a population abiding by these rules and customs and enacting justice. But when you have people who just flat out refuse to follow suit, that's when law steps in. That's its function. So I guess what I'm saying is if you have judges who, okay, you have a community, they're all abiding by their customs. They take somebody who's not abiding by them, bring them in front of a magistrate. So now you have a judge. They make some kind of pronouncement on the case. Maybe that's the end of it. when you have situations come up where this stuff happens, the same things are happening over and over again, the same types of the same types of situations where a crime is legitimately committed, then for that person to say, well, the judge doesn't have to just like reconsider all the baseline foundations for every case. You can codify that and enact it as a statute, which is what we see in the Bible. We see David doing that, right? So I don't understand how, therefore,
just because David did it doesn't mean,
unbiblical.
just because he did it doesn't mean that's the responsibility of the state now to do that. That doesn't mean it. Doesn't mean
Okay,
it's
but even if you take it away from the state, how is it still non-legislation? And that's what I'm saying is I'm thinking of legislation as a principle. Whereas if you say, nope, it's only legislation if there's a penalty attached. All right, by that definition, then you're right. I would agree with you. But what I'm saying is legislation goes beyond that. It isn't just here's a law, here's a penalty. And the reason I brought up how we view the Torah, the Pentateuch, where you say this is a law code. Well, there's a lot of things in it that aren't in any other law code in the world, not just like a specific law that deals with something God calls good or bad, but like where he gives like purpose clauses. Like if somebody gives you his coat as a down payment, don't keep it past midnight because that's his coat. What else is he going to sleep in? Like you don't find that in a law code anywhere else. So that's not a law. It's wisdom, it's a principle, it's a foundation to a law, you could say. But so when we read the Pentateuch, there's all kinds of this stuff that pops up that makes you say, okay, on the one hand, yes, there are laws with punishments, and there you go. That's the law part. But baked into all of that is also all these underlying principles that God clearly wanted us to dwell on day and night and to apply in every situation that we can rightfully apply it to.
Yeah,
now,
well, I am saying that if legislation, if it is legislation, it must have a penalty attached to it from the state. That's what I'm talking about, from the state. Because if not, then it's just a suggestion. It's just advice. At the end of the day, they can say this is a law. You have to, you have to do this speed on the road. And if there's no punishment, then it's just a suggestion. It's just advice. That's it.
So was God just suggesting every law that he gave without a punishment? Were those just suggestions?
No. God's law is still binding. We have a responsibility to follow God's law. We do not have a responsibility to follow man's law. That's the difference.
Correct. So if God gives us a law and we're responsible to follow that, and the example of that law was given it by God in a context, and we can draw parallels to a context where everything's exactly the same. It's just painted a different color, right? Yeah. It's instead of this technology from an axe head, it's technology to a car. God says, go out of your way to preserve life. Don't kill people, but also actively try to protect them. Whether that's an axe head or a car, those principles, those quote unquote laws should still apply and carry over.
Responsibility.
So who enforces that?
The responsibility was given to you and me. The responsibility was given to the state. That was not to the magistrate when we're talking about
until someone violates it, right?
Well, I got a question for Chris. Hang on a sec. Chris, and I appreciate you coming on here. I've done my best to stay out of it, but I'm trying to help our listeners. Okay. Trying to help our listeners here. If something happens, I think we all agree there's new technology. There's stuff that is not invented now that will be in the future. Does a magistrate, does a judge need anything more than the scriptures to adjudicate a case? So, I'll just let you know, on the road I live on.
Facts of the case.
Okay, great. Of course, yes. But does he need legislation? So, for example, on the road I live on, I don't think I've ever seen a police officer sitting and pulling anyone over. I think people drive over the speed limit all the time on this road. So our current system isn't preventing that. However, if you have biblical law and people were actually, for example, drunk driving, if they were executed for negligent death, I think that would actually cut down on reckless driving way more than our current system. But related to that, does a judge need legislation to apply justice to a case? Does he need that? Or can he look? He doesn't need
man-made legislation. Does he need it? No.
Okay, so there's no need for man-made legislation for justice. I guess my follow-up question would be, then why do we need it, and why not accept Luke's position?
Well, Luke's position is that it's unbiblical and toto.
Well, I'm just asking you, if we don't need it, I'm just taking a different tactic. If you're saying we don't need it for justice, why would we have it? Because you admitted it can be abused.
Because it's still beneficial. It can still also be beneficial. So again, we're talking on the one hand, is it a need? If you had just the Bible and the facts of a case, could you rightfully adjudicate? Yeah, of course.
So does
that mean it's wrong to have a system of like historical examples of case law to aid you in that decision as well? Well, there's nothing wrong with it, but could you do it without it? Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think
so. I'm not trying to make it dogmatic, like you have to have it, but my goal in having this conversation with Luke was trying to say, why is it completely unbiblical if it does happen? And it seems to me that the responses I get, they're very all or nothing. It's like, well, it's either always corrupt or it can't exist at all. And I'm like, well, what about just a wise application of a biblical principle to a modern situation?
That's what the Pope and the Pharisees were doing.
So again, yeah, it's a corruption, but I'm just saying not every law that will ever be made has to be corrupt by the fact that it's made. It's corrupt when people fail to live it out appropriately.
Do you have one example? Do you have one example of a man-made law that is not used for corrupt purposes? Just one?
Probably not in my lifetime. I don't know. I would have to go through and think about it. But I would say
that is our Chris. I mean, that is our
speed limit law. That is our speed limit law in principle is just and right. But I think where the abuse comes is what the civil magistrate does in response to it and how they collect on it, right? They use it as a means to fund the state. They pay themselves by busting speeders. I think that's a horrible abuse of it. But I think the principle of don't speed in front of a school is absolutely just, right, and biblical.
What if you're rushing someone to the hospital?
Yeah, there's mitigating circumstances all the time. People understand these categories of law, but I'm just saying
the law can't,
whether you want to call that non-legislation, but we still agree that, okay, there are ways we can enact this wisdom, this principles that preserves lives. Okay, that's fine. I would say, well, there's still a legislative principle in that. It's not legislative in the sense that we are pretending to be God by redefining morality itself, but you're still enacting a legislative principle in there that aids the legal process, whether on a communal level, on state, nation, whatever. And I think we agree on a lot of this stuff. It's just that you're very adamant about calling it, no, it's non-legislation, whatever. And so, okay, I mean, fair enough, but I think
what you're desiring is the function of customs and traditions. That's it. They cannot be law. Law cannot be taken over by custom and traditions, and custom and tradition cannot be overtaken by law. And that's what the Pharisees were doing. They were teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And that's what we oppose. They were taking this,
as doctrines, well, of course, yeah.
Right.
We're talking about law.
But they were saying you need to follow this or you're sinning. Right? They would pass a law and they'd say, if you don't follow this, you are in sin. And that's what they're telling Christ. You're not
following
the laws we made up.
But I could just as easily say, don't speed. It's not a sin if you speed, but if you end up killing someone because you're speeding, then you are sinning. So therefore, it's a good idea.
Advice. It's not a law. It's advice. It's not a law. It's advice.
Sure, but then if somebody breaks it and hits somebody, you have the weight of the law behind it anyways.
Not necessarily. It's your advice.
Private citizen. If you are a private citizen and you enact the coercive function of law on your own, you're still enacting law.
It's not law.
Just as a private citizen, rather than as a civil magistrate.
Chris, it's not law. That's not law. When I enact stuff on my own property, it's not law because the person can leave at any time. Doesn't have to follow it. They don't have to come onto my property. It's not a law. The law that we're talking about.
If he is there and he's doing something on your property that you say that's not allowed, my property, my rules, but he continues to do it anyways, you're going to start enacting coercive measures or call the cops or call the civil magistrate to get involved. So at that point, law gets brought in no matter what. Now you can sit there and say it was just a suggestion. It wasn't law for me to tell him he can't do this, but I doubt that he's going to see the difference when he's put in handcuffs or executed for violating your private property rules.
No, he's not going to be executed for violating private property. What are we talking about? That's not God's law. That God never says
Right.
that.
Well,
You should be
whatever
exited
the
for
case
violating
is,
private property rules.
whatever punishment then, right? If he's
Chris,
put
you
in
don't know the law.
handcuffs and
Chris, you
called
don't know
off
the
if
law.
he's
This is the problem.
trespassed.
Chris, you don't know the law. And this is the problem.
I do know the law.
You're bringing in these like, well, he'll be executed if you don't follow his private. And I'm like, and I have to tell you, that's not a law. Why did you bring that up? That's not a law.
It was an example.
Okay, but we're really talking about where the law begins and ends here. And that's what we're trying to talk to people about, where this law begins and where it ends. And we're wasting time coming up with scenarios where it's like, well, what if this unbiblical thing happens? Well, if we knew the law, then we never asked that question, right? We got to know the law. The law never says this is what happened.
You can bring up what if an unbiblical thing happens, but when I do it, I'm missing the point.
What did I bring up that was unbiblical? What did I?
Well, every time I say it's in principle possible to enact legislation that's not in and of itself unbiblical.
Not a biblical claim. Not a biblical claim. You didn't get that from the Bible. The Bible never says that. You can't point to chapter and verse that we need to be doing that.
If you define legislation as if there has to be a penalty attached at the moment of breaking the speed limit by 1, then
yes.
sure. Yeah.
Legislation involves a penalty. Otherwise, it's just a suggestion.
Not biblically. Biblically, there is all kinds of quote unquote law that we treat as law. We treat as God's Torah. And so maybe what we need to do is start conceiving of law itself in a broader category than just you do this, you receive a punishment, because biblically it treats it differently.
There is a punishment. If I break God's moral law, there is a punishment, Chris. There is a punishment if I break God's moral law. There's a punishment for every sin.
Right.
It all gets a punishment.
Right, from God. But now we're talking about
from God, because he's allowed to do that.
Between men, between humans.
But when he tells us, the civil magistrate, here's why I want you to get involved, that's where we get involved. And when he doesn't tell us to get involved, the civil magistrate does not get involved. It's that simple. It's not the responsibility.
But when God makes those announcements and the examples that were given, he gives them in examples that don't apply to us today, but we can see parallel examples that do apply to us today, right?
All of God's law applies to us today.
Right, but we don't go sacrificing animals. And if I don't have a parapet, I don't build a fence up there.
Right, because we read the New Testament that says stop sacrificing animals. That's it. You just ask the question, what's still a sin? What's still a sin? That's all you do. What's still a sin? If it's still a sin to commit adultery, then the punishment comes along with it. That's easy. Because it said in 1 Timothy chapter 1, the law is not laid down for the just, and he mentions the sexually immoral. Okay, so that's just it's that easy. If it's not a sin anymore, then we don't punish people for it. And not to mention that there is hardly any sort of punishment that was given for the violations of the cleanliness laws. I mean,
is it a sin not to build a parapet? That's a sin. That's a moral sin.
Yes, but it's not a law that can be punished. You can't punish somebody
unless someone falls off.
Unless someone falls off, yeah. The justice is between a man and his neighbor, not between a man and his community.
I got a question for Chris to carry this. I know it's been going great here. We got a few more minutes, however long you guys can stay. And Luke, I want you to respond to this too. The idea of, well, in the Bible, there were in our modern times, there are things the Bible didn't know about, or, of course, we'd all agree God knew they would come, but they're not in there. But wouldn't it be also fair to say that even in the Bible times, there were many scenarios that were not covered in the Old Testament law? And would the argument then apply back then? Well, they should have kept adding laws to it, because there were certainly things that weren't covered in Deuteronomy or in the law that could have happened back then.
Well, it seems like they did. I mean, in 1 Samuel 10, you have Samuel write up, I don't even know what you would call it, basically a constitution. Once the first king gets anointed, 1 Samuel 10, what is it, 20-something, 25? Samuel writes something and adds it to the law. And it's basically the rules of how the nation is going to operate under the kingship. Right. And I agree that's descriptive, right? So it's not saying here's what every nation has to do, but it is just describing once Israel got a king, they made this law code, and we're not told what it is. I forget the exact word they used to describe the thing itself, but it's basically a law code or some kind of constitution. So yes, I think they absolutely did that. I think they were supposed to do that by abiding by God's moral commands, the wisdom, the prudence, all that, and apply it as these new situations popped up through history. They give us an example of David doing it. And okay, so we just keep doing that, but we make it consistent with biblical revelation.
Okay, then Samuel told the people the rights and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. That's it?
There you go. There you go.
He's legislating?
I didn't say he was legislating.
Okay.
I said he's writing, in effect, what you would call a constitution. I mean, you think about the American Constitution being a procedural document that just outlines how law is going to go. However you think the Constitution itself was good or bad, or Christian or not Christian, the fact is it's a procedural document that is then given the force of law behind it by saying this is how we're going to operate, and if people step outside of this, there are punishments, there are consequences, whatever they might be, right? But you're putting the weight of law behind it for the sake of telling people they have to follow it. And it's the responsibility of all the citizenry to try to uphold those things. But yes, the civil magistrate are those who are specifically appointed to carry out the punishments when the time comes. But everybody still plays a role in that, right? So when Samuel gives Israel this new whatever it is, we
don't know if it was new. We have no idea if it was new, right? For all we know, he could have just wrote Deuteronomy and gave it to him. We have no idea what he did there, right? But it's still not legislating. He's just saying, here, this is what you have to do. Here's your responsibility.
Well, it says he added it. He added it. So I doubt he was just rewriting something
Samuel
that was already
people
there.
The rights and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it before the Lord. Where does it say added it?
Hold on, let me see. What version are you reading?
ESV.
ESV, okay. What was the verse? 25, right? 24, 25?
25.
Spoke with the people about the legal judgments of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before Yahweh. Oh, okay, maybe it doesn't say added.
Well, maybe there's a verse that says added, but he's not creating new law. He's just reiterating, probably just Deuteronomy.
Samuel spoke with the people about the legal judgments of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before Yahweh.
Yes.
Yeah. So you think that's just him rewriting Deuteronomy?
It's still not legislating. He could. I mean, for all we know, he said, "Here's your responsibilities," and maybe he just rephrased some of Deuteronomy. I don't know, but he did not create new law. I mean, again, David goes back in Psalm 119, or if it is David, what he wrote was that God's law was perfect as is. And that's all we're saying. And it's enough in the land. And if we have justice in the land, we'll have peace.
Yeah. Well, and again, I agree with all of that. But when I'm talking about God's law being perfect as it is, it clearly doesn't. So here's a situation that would have been common in the ancient world that does not pop up in any legal code in the Bible. When you, if you build like an outhouse upstream of a dude or some kind of slaughterhouse, a way of infecting water so that it comes downstream and it gets people sick, it can harm them, right? Does it make any sense to say that none of that was legislatable, or Israel got together and said, look, if you live upstream from somebody, don't build your outhouse on that stream.
It's already addressed. It's already addressed in the law of God. If a man causes a field of vineyard to be grazed over, Exodus 22, or lets his beast loose and feeds another man's field, he shall make restitution from the beast in his own field and his own vineyard. If a fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. So you already have these two laws that talk about.
So exactly. So how is it not then legislation to say, well, now we're applying that to the river, the stream? That would technically be legislation because you're applying the same principle to a new situation that isn't explicitly written in the law of God. But we would still say the law of God is perfect because it makes provisions for that kind of thing to be done, even though to the letter it is not addressed.
Right. So that's not creating a new law, because you can still make an outhouse that's upstream from somebody, and you can still let your poop go into the stream and let it affect the stream downriver. It's not, you haven't violated any law. It's only when a neighbor brings you to court. That's it. Okay, that's when you violate the law.
You're still operating on legislation, though. If you bring them in front of a judge and the judge says, yes, that was wrong, you should move the outhouse. And let's say the guy says, well, I don't want to move the outhouse. And then it happens again. And then the judge says, now you're doubly wrong. So now we're going to punish you. How is that not in any way legislation?
Because there's no law. Can we agree? There's no law in the Bible that talks about what happens if two prostitutes bring a baby to you. No law.
As far as I know. Yeah.
Okay. Did Solomon create a new law that every baby that's brought to him, they don't know who it is, you have to cut it in half?
I would say he acted on legislation, but he didn't create a new law.
Okay, that's all he did. He took principles from the Bible and he passed a judgment. Was not a new law. No new law was needed. No law. I mean, see right here. I have these laws that talk about who's responsible when my property damages your property. All right. There's a basic principle there. There's nothing in the Bible about how to identify whose baby is. I mean, nothing. So he didn't legislate. He did not create a new law. And those two women didn't appeal to a new law and ask for a new law. Never once was legislation on the table. He just had the law of God. He adjudicated rightly, and then people got justice. That's what Job was doing as well in Job chapter 29. People were coming
and David does the same thing. That's off the table as far as you're concerned.
I'm sorry?
When David does legislate, it literally says he enacts a statute that remained throughout the land of Israel. That's off the table.
If he is punishing people for not following it, then yes, he's adding to the law of God. If it's a custom, that's like, hey, that's a really good idea, because David set up the whole temple process. He set up everything. You sing this song at this time. When you guys come in here at this day, you have to sing this song and all this kind of stuff. He set up all that, right? But none of it was law.
Mm-hmm.
If you violated it, you were not punished. It was just custom, and that's how they did the temple. That's how they did. I mean, it was all about what David did. Right. If you didn't sing that psalm at that time, it wasn't like you were brought out and stoned. It was just like a violation of custom. And I don't know if David, we can't really use him as an example because we don't know what that looked like. We cannot use that as an example. We know from Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 12, he was not allowed to add to the law of God. And he did. And
I guess what's significant about this is that in the LSB, I'm reading the LSB, it says, so it has been made from that day forward that he made it a statute and a judgment for Israel to this day. A statute and a judgment. And that word for statute, it's broad. Okay, it can mean, basically, it could take a sense of what you call a custom. It could take a sense of a law with a penal sanction. We're not told about any penal sanctions given for violating this. What we are told is that it's a statute and a judgment. So what that says to me is this was not a previous law from Moses, right? So this is David outside of those specific situations. He made a statute that was perpetual, that lasted to this day in Israel's history, okay? And there is a judgment attached to it. So he judged a situation the way a judge would do today and made a perpetual statute based off that one situation that lasted. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, it doesn't tell us there was a penalty for people who violated it. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. I don't need to guess. But the point is, this is a legislative function. Now, I'm not defining legislative the way you are, in that he's redefining right and wrong. He's making the way God does, establishing moral law for the bedrock of humanity, right? It's different than that. It mimics what God does when he does that, but it's done on a human level in a certain context, because Israel, as it existed then, no longer exists today. So that specific statute that David made is gone. It expired with Israel. It's no longer valid as it existed then. But we can still read that.
Valid? Is Deuteronomy 4:2 still valid?
It's valid for what it applies to, yes, today.
Okay, all right,
yes.
Right. So, we should not be adding to or taking away from God's law. Correct?
Right, but if we do it in the way David did it, then that's not violating Deuteronomy 4:2, and yet, in a way, it's still
Chris, we can't use him as an example because we don't know how he did it. We cannot use him as an example. He's not a good example. I have right here, 2 Chronicles 24, verse 3. Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. Talks favorably. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days. Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. Descriptive. Does that mean polygamy is okay?
No.
Okay. So we got to stop using David as an example. We cannot say, here's what David did, so therefore it's okay for us. No.
There's a relevant difference.
It's descriptive of what happened, and it talks favorably about what happened. And you're saying, well, since that happened, hey, Genesis chapter 1 is only for them in that time period, right? So the consistent application of what you're saying is, if something happens in the Old Testament that's talked about favorably, that's descriptive. That means we can do it too. Because otherwise, I don't see how you get that what David without saying that.
Well, because it's comparing an evil use of there's a situation where evil is happening and David is rectifying that situation. So it's not merely just describing, like the same way, I don't know, take any sin that's spoken of in the Bible, you read in the Old Testament and say, oh, look, the Bible describes something, therefore it's prescribing what we should do today. No, that's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm doing here. And there's a difference between what's going on here and the examples of polygamy that you're drawing on to draw the analogy. Okay?
How do we know that polygamy is wrong?
Because God made Eve for Adam, because Jesus said,
Go
one
back
man,
to
one
God's
woman.
law. Right. We go
Yeah.
back to God's law. Right. How do I know
Right.
if David did what you're describing and he said, and he was violating God's law, how do I know that he was wrong?
You don't know he was wrong.
Yes, I do, because I have chapter and verse saying, don't do what David did.
4:2. Right,
And
but you're taking
12:32,
that in
twice.
in an absolute restrictive sense, the same way the
Yes.
Pharisees would, mind you, where they
No,
say, "Hey, as long as I'm
the
abiding by
Pharisee said the
letter of
opposite.
law,
Chris, the Pharisee
no,
said the
as long as
opposite.
I'm abiding by the letter of
Chris,
the law, I can tie
Chris,
still
the
and
Pharisee
tuning
said
and
the
tying,
opposite. Chris,
but
the
I can
Pharisee said the
neglect
opposite.
weightier matters of the law, so
Chris, you
long
don't
as
know
I
your
am
Bible.
abiding by the letter.
Chris, you don't know your Bible. The Pharisees were doing the opposite.
I'm familiar.
They were saying, let's add to and take away from the law of God. That's what they were doing. Because Jesus said to them, here's the law. You should have been enforcing it. Instead, you're making up new legislation around it. You should not be doing that. That's wrong.
And ignoring deeper principles built into it. Like there's both happening with the Pharisees.
Never said
they
that.
Absolutely neglect the weightier matters. No, Jesus never said neglecting weightier matters.
Yes.
So there's a twofold
specific
error that the Pharisees commit, right? One is overdoing the law, one is underdoing it.
No, they never overdid the law. Chris, what are you talking about? They never did the law. What do you mean? He said you're not following God's law.
They're adding to it.
They're adding to God's law. They're not overdoing it. They never did God's law. That's the accusation. You should be following God's law, but you're not. You're following your own laws.
Those errors happen in two ways: by either neglecting certain things they should have been doing, or doing things they should not have been doing. Right?
Yes, but they never did the law.
Error.
They never did the law.
Right. So that's all I'm saying is when you say we can't use David as an example of a possible legislation that falls within God's bounds but still is enacting a principle.
That's eisegesis.
Right? If it's consistent with God's law, because that's what this verse is telling us.
Chris, we don't build rules off of a possible verse could mean this. We don't take that and say, okay, let's go back and reinterpret the Old Testament. All right, and say, oh, Deuteronomy 4:2 is no longer applicable. Yes, you are saying Deuteronomy 4:2 is no longer applicable because David did it. Okay, then. No, okay, it's
I'm saying it's not applicable in the absolute strictest way that you're using it. Yes,
the plain reading of the text. The plain reading of the text is do not add to it, do not take away.
The plain reading of the text is God is telling that to Israel at a certain time in a certain place, that he's given a moral foundation and laws are built on that, and they shouldn't deviate from that to the right or the left.
Tell me what law in Deuteronomy, Chris, what law in Deuteronomy can you not say that about? Chris, what law in Deuteronomy can you not just say what you just said? Tell me what law that if you said to me, Luke, we should be following the law in Deuteronomy, this law right here, X law. And I said, well, that's for that time, that place, in that context. And you say, well, hang on a sec. It says right here, you shall not murder. I say, whoa, that's a strict reading of the text. Yeah, hold on a second now. What law in Deuteronomy can you not just say that you said that's for them and that time and place? What law in Deuteronomy can I not come back at you when you say we should be following this law in Deuteronomy? What law can I not say that about?
Wearing mixed fabrics, planting different seeds in the same field. That might be Leviticus, but the whole Torah, right? Deuteronomy comes at the end of all of that. So you get Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, right? You have all the law. So whenever Deuteronomy was written, everything
that's not my question, Chris.
The law.
Chris, that's not my question. Chris,
so anything in Leviticus, anything in Deuteronomy, a lot of that is applicable. A lot of that we apply using principles because we're not in the same technological and economic situation.
That's not my question, right? Chris. What law in
Jubilee
Deuteronomy?
Laws. We don't follow Jubilee laws.
Right, but Chris, what law in Deuteronomy do you think that we need to follow? Give me a law. Choose a law, any law that we need to be following today.
Do you not think we should follow the laws in Deuteronomy?
Just give me an example of a law you think we should be following from Deuteronomy.
All right, hold on. that we should follow that we're not? Or
Yes. No, just give me any law that we should be following right now.
on the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the mouth of 1 witness.
Okay, you think we should be following that law?
Correct.
You think it's still abiding?
When the death penalty is on the table for whatever crime was committed, it should be on 2 witnesses at the least, and not
Chris,
1.
I'm sorry, that's a simplistic reading of the text. That's for that time and that place.
Yeah, I knew you were going to do that, but again, there are relevant differences between the example that I'm bringing up.
But
and
your
the way
designation is
you're trying to
arbitrary,
use
Chris.
it.
Chris, your designation is arbitrary. You're saying this one is, and
It's
this one
not
is
arbitrary.
Yes, it is. Where do you see in Scripture that we should not, that Deuteronomy 4:2 is a bad idea for today?
I didn't say it was a bad idea for today. I think it's completely binding for today. I'm just saying it's not in its most simplistic, literalistic fashion the way you're using it, meaning to the extent that if we say, well, we have new situations in modern life that didn't happen in Israel in the strictest literal sense, but God has given us a perfect law and we can take those principles and apply them today. You know, you might call that legislation. I might call it legislation. You might not call it legislation, whatever. We're taking those principles and applying them through law to stuff today. And I'm saying that is not a violation of Deuteronomy 4:2, but that doesn't mean I'm nullifying Deuteronomy 4:2. I'm saying David can do the same thing in Israel, and it's not violating Deuteronomy 4:2 because he's not going outside of the point of the law. Spiritual principles that Christ accused the Pharisees of negating when they ignored the weightier matters. There's evidently biblically a spiritual principle.
We don't reduce the law to the point of the law. We don't reduce it to the point of the law.
It's not a reduction.
The law, okay, is the law good if it's used lawfully? Is the law good if it's used lawfully?
Yes, of course.
Okay, does Deuteronomy 4:2 tell us how to use the law lawfully?
No. It just says don't go outside of God's law.
It says don't add to it, don't take away from it.
Then there you go. Yeah, that's how you use it lawfully.
Okay, don't add to it, don't take away from it. Should the state or the civil magistrate be adding or taking away from the law of God?
Okay, making a speed limit law is not in the way you're meaning adding or taking away.
Okay, but hold on a second. Should the magistrate be adding to or taking away from the law of God?
Not in the way that you're talking about it. No, of course not.
Okay, right. They shouldn't be. Okay, so right. So what does it mean to add or take away the law of God to you? What does that mean? Can you give me an example of somebody adding to the law of God?
Yeah.
Okay.
By saying, so this would be an example. Would be if you took a parapet, right, and you built the parapet, or no, you took a house, you didn't build a parapet, okay, and then somebody comes and falls off. And you don't punish that person because you say, well, it's their fault. They shouldn't have fallen off my roof, right? But then someone says, well, the law says don't build a parapet, or you should have built a parapet, right? That would be an abuse of God's law, right? I'm not
talking about abuse of God's law. I'm talking about adding to the God's law. Have you seen in history people who have added to God's law? Can you give me an example of somebody who's added to God's law?
Yeah. Well,
okay,
of course.
Who? I mean, what is the law?
I think a lot of tax laws are unbiblical, for example. Okay. Right.
All right.
So a lot of tax laws. I think there's a lot of things that are way overregulated that have nothing to do with the preservation of life. They have nothing to do with anything even close to a biblical principle.
Is it the magistrate's responsibility to preserve life? Is it the magistrate's responsibility to preserve life?
Yes.
Is that responsibility given to him by God? Preserve life?
Yes.
Where
it says he's a minister for good.
Okay, it doesn't say he's supposed to preserve life.
Romans 13.
It doesn't say
how is preserving life not part of being a minister for good?
Because we don't isolate the text. Because it says he's an avenger for your good. He's a servant, right? He says a lot of things. Just because he's my servant doesn't mean he has to come to my house and make me breakfast in bed. We take it in context.
But that's a completely different situation. I'm not saying it's there for the magistrate's job to come make you breakfast, make you go to bed on time.
But you're saying, you're taking a phrase and you take it to mean like this broad umbrella. Well, since he's there for your good, to do good would be to preserve your life. So therefore, he has to preserve your life. There's no therefore
biblical bounds.
No,
the Bible puts bounds on what that means, right? I'm not just throwing that up as an abstract and saying, oh, if any magistrate says, I feel like this is the preservation of the good for for the people, I can do whatever I want. No,
within biblical bounds.
Read
Outside
more
of that verse,
the Bible than just 2 verses and come
outside
to our
of that verse,
freedoms.
outside of that verse, where do you see the civil magistrate has a responsibility to preserve life? Outside of that verse. Okay, there's none. All right, we can agree. There's no responsibility given by God. You need to be out there preserving life. That's not the responsibility of the state. Okay, they're not there to do that. They're there to avenge him who does wrong, and that's why we pay taxes, so that they can punish the evildoer and praise those who do good. Mm-hmm. There is no responsibility for them to preserve life. They are there to avenge. But Job was
how is avenging not preserving life? So if you punish a murderer, if you put to death a murderer, how is that not preserving the life of the innocent? Like, those things are linked, right? So I agree. I hear what you're saying.
It's a byproduct. Right. It's a byproduct, okay, but sure. It's not the responsibility. Sure. It's not the responsibility. It's a
byproduct of their responsibility, right? If their responsibility, it is a byproduct.
Yes, but it's not their responsibility.
They are preserving life.
Right. Yes. It's a byproduct, but it's not their responsibility. That's a byproduct. Whether it saves no one, they still have a responsibility. If they preserve nobody's life by doing justice, they still have the responsibility. Mm-hmm. It's irrelevant whether or not they're preserving people's lives. It's not the state's responsibility to preserve life. That's my and your responsibility as we love our neighbor. It's not the state's responsibility to do that. Neither is it the church's. It's our responsibility to preserve life, not the state's. And that's why they can't be passing speed limit laws, because it's not their responsibility.
How do you logically go from one to the other? Because the speed limit law is not about telling you how to live your best life. It's not about here's how you preserve your life. It's about placing a restriction on a known quantifiable situation that ends life, right?
It's not quantifiable. It's not quantifiable. Danger is not quantifiable. You can't quantify danger, because danger means something different to everyone.
We can observe and measure deaths per year due to cars. Right?
No, can't trust the data. You can make data say whatever you want.
Well, I'm not saying it has to be perfect down to the one, but
it better be if we're passing law. If we're passing law, it better be. If I'm being carted away for prison, I have to surrender money. I don't want someone to say, "Well, it's not perfect. It's just the best we got." It better be perfect, and that's why we only go with the law of God, because that's the only perfect standard. That's why we keep saying
there's a threshold, right? There's a threshold for all of that. So everybody recognizes there's a distinction between, you say, look, at minimum, we can observe and measure X amount of car accidents due to speeding per year.
No, Chris, no, we don't. We don't legislate. We don't make people do things based on my observations. We don't do that. That's not a responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the state to come along and say, "Oh, I've observed this, so therefore now you have to do what I tell you to do." That's ridiculous. That's not the responsibility.
If I observe a crime, I can't use the fact that I observed it as the reason why I'm hauling that person before a magistrate.
If you observe a crime, but the Bible defines crime, not the state. They don't define crime. That's Deuteronomy 4:2 in action.
The Bible defines morality. Nations define crime specifically.
No, Bible defines crime. Nations do not define crime.
It does give us many examples of crimes, yes, but it defines primarily morality, and then we have crime laws that are built.
God's law says it's the Bible.
The crime because it's violating this moral principle.
No. The state has not responsibility to define crime. That's not their responsibility. Never given them by Scripture. They are God's enforcer to bring God's wrath on the evildoer, not man's wrath. God's wrath. They're not there to define crime. I think maybe we're getting to the heart of this now. They're not there to define crime. They're not there to keep us safe. They're not there to preserve life. They're that just to avenge the wrongdoer.
Make a distinction there. Make a clarifying distinction there. By define crime, you mean elements of morality, right? God says, "Thou shalt not kill." Okay, thou shalt not kill. Therefore, killing is a crime, right? When I talk about legislating, what can the state define crime as? I'm not saying, well, they're allowed to come along and say, well, God says thou shalt not kill. We're going to say you can kill. Now we're redefining morality. That's not what I'm talking about at all. And I would agree with you that that is bad. That is wrong. That is not.
But you are talking about the state defining crime.
In a different sense than what than what I just defined it as, correct. Yes, in a different sense. So here, make this logical distinction, which we can do, right? So you can say, on the one hand, God defines right and wrong, good and evil, in a universal, foundational sense.
And he defines crime.
He defines crime. And then nations pop up and they say, we see all those things. And as hopefully wise people get into power and try to make wise laws, they keep it consistent with the crime that God has already defined and just apply it to new situations that aren't specifically addressed, but they are addressed in principle.
That can be done without legislation.
But how is it not legislation?
Luke, explain the difference
by definition, how is that non-legislation?
Luke, explain the difference between adjudication and legislation.
Yeah, I'll explain the difference, right? So legislation will say, okay, you shall not murder. Okay. Now, the difference here is a girl goes to an abortion clinic and kills her baby. Okay. Now, if we just go with legislation, we have to kill her. Adjudication comes in and says, okay, what happened? Well, my stepdad was raping me and he forced me at gunpoint to go in and get an abortion. Okay. I'm going to say you're not guilty of murder because you were forced to. I'm going to bring the stepfather in, and we're going to kill him. He's going to be responsible after, that's a difference, right? Even though the law says you shall not murder.
Both are happening. That's legislation and adjudication happening.
Right. God's legislation, man's adjudication in the legislation, and God's legislation. It couched
so that's
in
not
the
non-legislative, though.
Yeah, it is.
But then, in what meaningful way is that?
Because he's not making a new law that everyone else. He's not making a new law that everyone else has to follow now. He's not making a new law. That's legislation. Making a new law. What's that?
It's already a legislation, though. It's already legislation.
Right. God's law.
God's legislation. Thou shalt not murder. Okay. Someone commits abortion, but through adjudicating, you find out there are mitigating factors. Right. Okay. So you have legislation and adjudication happening. Right.
Yes.
But I'm just saying, reasonably, without jumping to all the extremes and the slippery slope arguments that you keep throwing, where if we say it's possible to make one good law ever, therefore the only thing that will come of it are a bunch of bad laws.
I'm still waiting.
I don't disagree that historically that's what happened.
Yeah,
like a speed limit law.
Yeah,
right. Like a speed limit law where you have it be for that community. Don't speed on this road. If you do 26 into 25,
not the responsibility of the state.
We're not going to send you to jail. We're not going to. But if you end up killing somebody, then you are more liable because you are violating an already known speed limit.
That's not speed limit law.
It looks different than a speed limit laws we have now. Sure. So I have no problem with rethinking.
It's just a suggestion. That's all it is.
Okay.
It's not a law.
In the same way that God suggests we ought to preserve life.
God's law. All of God's law has a penalty.
Until somebody dies, and then there's a penalty.
All of God's law has a penalty.
But again, there's a distinction between God enacting his own penalties in an eternal sense for covetousness, which we don't criminalize, right? Being covetousness is not a crime, but it is sinful, right? So in an eternal sense, we will be held responsible for being covetousness, okay? But when we talk about law between man and man, it's a little bit different than all of what God's doing in that foundational sense.
Right, and the only reference point is God's law. That's it. The only reference point is God's law. If someone sins against a man, he takes him to court. We use God's law to adjudicate. That's it. The legislative function is restricted to God. Deuteronomy 4:2. Do not add to it. Do not take away from it. That's all we're saying. It's simple.
So if that exact thing happened 100 times in a month and someone said, okay, we're just going to write this down and make it perpetual. Like, hey, if this is the situation and you do X, Y, Z, the same.
No, because you can't do that because you need
a trial.
Well, first off, you need a body of people to enforce that. You need a police force because otherwise it means nothing.
Anybody. It could be the community.
You can't just do what I'm saying. You can't just do one law like that is what I'm saying. It can't just do one law. It's like saying we need people who come into this country to do a test, right? A test of faith. And then they're allowed to come in once they pass the test. Okay, so you pass that law. And then the people are like, you know what? I'm going to go around your checkpoint station. Now you have to make a law to go around the checkpoint station. And now they say, okay, now I'm being brought in. I'm just going to lie about everything. And now they have to make it a crime to lie. And now, they might say, well, people from this nation aren't allowed in. I'm just going to lie about where I came from. So you can't just do one law and then it be done. You have to keep on legislating because now you've established man as the definer of what is a crime. And now people are going to man to say, hey, is this a crime? Is that a crime? Is this a crime?
And you have to legislate. Their operating principles, sure. They're establishing how the people who make that law for who it's relevant.
Through tradition and custom, yes. Through tradition and custom, people can regulate themselves.
There can still be a coercive function behind tradition and custom, but
yes, using tradition and custom, but it's not the state's responsibility to legislate. Can we agree?
It depends on the situation.
Okay.
I can't
Biblically
say
speaking, does
absolutely
God
yes or
ever
no.
give the state responsibility to legislate?
Yes.
Where?
Okay.
I'm looking for chapter and verse. I have chapter and verse saying don't.
I don't.
Where's
okay,
your chapter and verse saying? Here's your response, Chris. This is what I need, Chris. I need a chapter and verse saying God saying to the civil magistrate, you need to add or take away from my law. You need to legislate and you need to create new things.
Okay, but I would never phrase it like that. For one, because God gives His law and specifically says don't add or take away from it. But when I read that verse, I read that verse and I take that and say, okay, well, this is God talking to His people at a specific time. But we live thousands of years after that, and obviously
Chris,
there's a lot of
that's not how Theonomist talks.
changed.
Chris, that's not how Theonomist talks.
Let me finish. Okay, we live thousands of years after that, and obviously there are things that have changed. There are laws that I read in the same book where you find Deuteronomy 4:2 that we don't live out in the same way that the Israelites did. There's a difference.
Yes, but we go to the Bible. We go to the Bible where it says don't do this. But it never says,
we go to the book of Hebrews. We go to Ephesians.
Right, Chris, where in the Bible does it give the state the responsibility to legislate? Where?
Okay.
Okay, it doesn't. Just say it doesn't.
It
Chris,
doesn't give the state the responsibility to legislate in the sense
That's all we want to know.
They are recreating right and wrong. I agree.
Or adding to the law of God.
All right. So, I think, go ahead, make your final point, Chris. Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, make your final point, and then I got a couple questions. We'll wrap this up.
Well, yeah. I would just say, when I hear you say non-legislative theonomy, again, like I've been trying to emphasize, there's so much that I agree with, right? There are a lot of things that I say, this would be so much better if we did things that way. So defining what we mean by legislation, if you say it's only stuff with a penalty attached to it, then I would say, okay, on that definition, it's fine to say we're non-legislative theonomous. But what I would say is when we talk about law, which legislation is, the word for law there, the Bible has more to it than just here's a law from God plus a penalty. There are quote unquote laws, His Torah, that includes things that are not penalized directly, but they guard people against. It's basically it's a hedge, right? It says, look, the crime is over here, but we're going to stop you 2 steps back, and there's no penalty for making 1 step. But if you do that and commit the 2nd step, there are punishments that follow. So I guess my point is, baked into all of that is this idea of wisdom and maturation, that whenever you do have a king like David, like Saul, God says, you tell Saul, do whatever you want. Put your hand to whatever you want to do. Just don't go outside of the bounds I have set. Okay. That's also in Samuel. So I guess the point is, I would call it maybe extremely restrictive legislative theonomy, or I don't know. I haven't developed entirely exactly how it would look because it's so different from all kinds of things that we experience today. And just to finish up, I would agree that you're pointing out things that are going wrong in law in the society. And I would agree with these are abuses. They are violations of God's law. And I'm keenly interested in trying to do things the right way, in a biblical way. But calling it non-legislative theonomy, I think, while I understand what you're getting at, and I think, again, there's tons of agreement and stuff that I wouldn't hesitate to abide by or to follow you on, I just think there's an area that you're not addressing, that you're kind of turning your eye to and say, no, Deuteronomy 4:2, therefore non-legislation en toto. There's no room for understanding how these principles can be applied and if we should even call that legislation or not. In the one hand, it seems like you do agree that we can take principles and apply them to new situations. You just wouldn't call that legislation per se. But I would say there's still a legislative principle happening there. It's just not at that foundational moral level that God gives us. So I don't know.
All right. No, thank you so much, Luke. I'm going to let you give a final thought here, and then I'm going to do what I did on a previous discussion. I got rapid fire questions for you both to answer. Luke, try to summarize any response you have to this whole discussion.
no,
Great discussion, by the way.
Yeah, it was, and thanks both Chris's for coming on. Especially thanks to you, Chris, for getting heated with me again. I mean, what you said there at the end, Chris. I mean, I don't really have much to say other than to maybe bring up. I'm not sure where you get this idea that it's a little bit more than Deuteronomy 4:2. I'm trying to think about where in the Bible you could make that claim and exegete that and say no, it's a little more complicated, and that was for them, but it's not really for us. And people talk about the Old Testament's filled with all these great principles, but I want to know what's the principle behind Deuteronomy 4:2. It's pretty plain and pretty clear. And again, that's the negative side, but the positive side is God keeps telling us all time and again that what he's given us is enough for life and godliness. And just using the law of God to adjudicate without making up new rules and new laws that come with penalties. God's law is always shown to be enough for everything that pertains to life and godliness. And as soon as you give the responsibility, give the different spheres of government responsibilities that they are not meant to have, as soon as you yield that to them, they abuse them. And I don't see how you can possibly give the state the responsibility, or anyone, their community, the responsibility to start creating these new rules that are not customs and they're not traditions. They're law. Like, doesn't matter what you do. If you break them, we're going to penalize you, or there's a punishment attached to it, or whatever. As soon as you do that, you've given an entity a responsibility they're not meant to have. And God is saying, he has shown you, oh man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly. And for us to worry about speed limits without worrying about, I mean, I'm not saying you're not worrying about justice, but justice in the land first, and then we'll figure out the speed limit problem later about who enforces them. But the only way we get justice is if the state is doing what God has told it to do, avenge the wrongdoer. And that's it. That's the only responsibility of the state.
All right. Thank you, Luke. All right. If you got a couple minutes, this is one of my favorite parts. We're going rapid fire here. I always like to apply this, and then we're going to be done. So I want to ask questions related to this topic. And the question specifically relates to, especially in our context in America, the civil magistrate punishing someone. This can be whether it's a fine, imprisonment, requiring them to make restitution to the state, quote unquote. So just try to keep your answer very brief, basically a yes or no. Would it be just if someone who was selling milk to their neighbors was punished because they didn't get a license from the state? Chris first, and then Luke.
No.
Ditto.
Okay. Would it be just if someone was driving on the road and did not have a driver's license or a vehicle registration, and they had to pay money to the state because they didn't have those things?
I'm going to say no.
That's an easy one. No, it's not just.
All right. You have someone who collects and sells guns. He has 500 guns and he sells them to his neighbors without a license. Would it be just for him to be punished for that?
No.
No.
All right. You have someone who does not register their children with the state because the state requires them to let them know if they're homeschooling their children. Would it be just for them to be punished for that?
No.
Same.
You have someone who has violated a zoning ordinance because his farm stand is 1,500 feet instead of 500, and now he's going to be punished if he doesn't basically reduce the size of his business. Would it be just for him to be punished?
Wait, say that again.
So
the answer is no, but say it again.
Yeah, it's actually happening here, and it happens all the time in this nation. A farmer has a farm stand, and his farm stand is too big. It's going against a zoning ordinance that says you can only display product on 500 square feet. If you go over that, you're violating our ordinance. So would it be just for him to be punished?
Yeah,
whether it's...
I see. I mean, I would say no. I would just add that there's, I don't know. These are very simplistic questions, and I understand the purpose of that. It's very meant to be straightforward.
Well, they're real life examples too.
Yes. Yeah. So with the farming one, I would say, well, no, of course you don't want to punish. What do you mean by punish? It depends on the situation, depends on the context, it depends on what that punishment is. I think there could be a situation where it is just for not the civil magistrate to come in and start fining and arresting, but a punishment technically could still be that person is not invited to wherever they are, the next year, if they're at a farmer's market and they have some kind of stand set up or whatever it is.
No, yeah.
So
it's private property.
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no based on how they're phrased, but I just think these situations, there's a lot more to it than just that sometimes. So
yeah, that's why I tried to frame it that this is the government punishing. And these are real life examples that are happening all the time across the nation, and they are generally all of them justified by the idea that it's for the common good. Okay, last one, and then we'll wrap up here. Someone does not pay their taxes and their house is taken from them. Is it just to punish them in any way for not paying their taxes to the government?
Depends on the taxes.
Okay, so there would be a situation where it would be just if someone didn't pay their taxes to the civil government, that they would either, in the end, it comes down to, we'll either take your stuff, right, which is a fine, and if you don't pay it, we're going to confiscate it, or we lock you up in prison. So, in the end, those are really the two punishments we have today. So you would say there'd be a situation where it's just for someone to have their property confiscated or to have their labor restricted because they didn't pay their taxes.
No, not in that scenario. No.
Okay. Luke?
Yeah, no. And for the previous question, no as well.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on. Luke, thanks for letting me host Think and Reform. Great discussion. We need more of these. We need to debate. We need to disagree. And there's a lot we agree on here. And so hopefully, Chris, you'll come back. We can have more of these discussions. Anybody listening that would like to come on, just reach out to us. Go to futureofchristendom.org. You can find all these podcasts. You can contact us. Let us know what you want to talk about, and let us know if you want to come on the show. All right. Well, that wraps it up for today. I'll close this out with Luke's line, which is to keep thinking. And how do you say it, Luke? Why don't you close this podcast? Because I don't even know how you close your podcast.
Oh man, Chris isn't listening to my podcast.
It's remember to you don't say think and reform is how you end it, but
yeah. Just remember, friends, think and reform.
That's right. All right. Remember, friends, think and reform. God bless.